I don't know anything about that. I remember Ray. I remember his involvement, but at that time, I had just completed my PhD. I was figuring out how I was going to get tenure,
Yeah.
so I wasn't paying as much attention to the internal workings, other than what was happening in the academic side of the house. But I don't really know.
I've got a call and I'm trying to get hold of him.
Yeah,
He retired from Michigan State.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Another thing mentioned is that the regents, the complexion of the Board of Regents changed. First when Nelson took over. And then it's not mentioned. That's why I'm kind of asking, well, what happened after Nelson left and then Reynolds was in and he left, and now it's back to Knowles, and it's like a conservative or Republican Democrat type poll. Do you have any insights as to what the dynamics were?
Well, there are a lot of colorful figures in the 50s and 60s, but my first real serious look at the regents began when I started serving as the acting provost at Oshkosh in 1984. Really attended my first regent meeting at that time. Now you pick up a lot of history if you listen closely about what happened in past boards, but one of the things, just as an overlay, whenever you have a shifting of political parties in the governor's chair, that occurred in 1986, 87. We had Tony Earl.
Yeah.
We had Lee Dreyfus. Then Lee Dreyfus kind of at the last minute said, "Oh, I'm not running." Republicans put a campaign together, ran against Tony Earl. Tony Earl won. So so you had a kind of Republican board. And then in comes a Democrat. So he's going to appoint just about half of the board. And then he loses. And Tommy Thompson comes in. He's a Republican again. So the board of regents has to adjust to that political dynamic. I mean, there's that one point when a new governor comes in where, okay, he's going to get 2, maybe 3 appointments. And so now the board is, you got the superintendent of public instruction, somebody from the technical college system, the president, and then you got 15 others. And so they begin to turn over. And somewhere around the 3rd year of the new governor, it's evident that the next year there's going to be some change in leadership. And my observation is that the board kind of gets together and says, yeah, we're from different parties, but our biggest obligation is to the university. So how are we going to do this without some kind of public display? And it gets done. Sometimes it's done where, okay, if the Republicans are coming in, the Democrats are going out. The Democrat is elected the chair or president of the board, and the vice chair is of the new group of people. But there's some kind of transition that occurs in there. That undoubtedly happened, though I don't think, people in the 50s and 60s, boards of regents were kind of like boards of education. They weren't high profile. It was pretty quietly done. They weren't big events like they are today. So I don't think there was as much contrast from an ideology standpoint. I think there were, again, this is from what I heard and what I've read, I think there were some very colorful regents. Arthur DeBarden-Layton from Park Falls would have been one of them who was mentioned as, and one that I got to see, Dr. Lawton from Marshfield Clinic. He was a Tony Earl appointee, very gracious man. So there's always a dynamic kind of going on, whether it's one party that controls it or you're in a transition party situation where regents are turning over. So in that time when Green Bay was established, we started out with largely Republican board because Warren Knowles was governor and he appointed his people. And at that time, the board wasn't 17. I think it might have been 15, maybe even less, because student representation came later. And the technical college president sitting on came later. So it might have been 13 or 14 or something like that. So the turnover happened quicker.
Were there any specific regions who were big proponents of UW Green Bay and Ed Widener and his vision that you know of?
That's a piece of history I don't know much about.
Okay. This touches on most of the questions that I had.
Mm-hmm.
Again, these are immediate questions.
Sure.
I have to pass on to you some of these documents, as oral history transcripts from Madison, because obviously you are deeply involved, and there's some things that I think will maybe refine your thinking because people are sharing their thoughts.
Sure.
And you'll say, oh.
Yeah. Well, any of these things, like I regard the years I served here as being a unique experience in higher education that maybe less than 1% of all people that went in higher education ever experience, and that's the coming together of a university. Because most of the universities were, by 1960, were in place. I mean, you can count on two hands. In Wisconsin, easily on one hand, the number of universities that were started after 1960, and that's two. And you could do that across most of the country. The exceptions are Arizona, Florida, California, where we've had this great growth of population and number of campuses has expanded. But watching that come together, particularly brand new university around a brand new theme, was a unique experience. I think we had some of the most colorful characters, really, in the history of higher education in that last half of that century. Many of them probably, not much is recorded about them. But
well, who needs work? This is good in terms of like collecting memories.
Yeah.
And whatever. Are there people who deserve more attention in terms of finding out what they were doing, thinking?
yeah, I think in that early group of people, Bill Lotch was certainly there and deserves he's got a lot of memories about the early part. Unfortunately, several of them, Dick Fonterra, for example, had passed away, Al Swinnerton, Connie Nelson, Alex Dobrins. Large proportion of these people are gone. But they were in that kind of, there was a sort of I don't want to call it a middle management because that sounds so un-university-like, but they were in that group that were at the associate professor level who were really engaged in the philosophy and ideology of the campus. And one of the reasons I could kind of look at this dispassionately, I was in the business program, and I mean, even the physical plant had business located outside the main core of the campus. There was this inner circle and the outer circle, and the outer circle there was supposed to be the professional studies, which I think was a failure in thinking because now today when you look at what I think is the natural connection between environmental policy and business, sustainability, it had to evolve, but at that time no one could see it. But those were some of the early people, and a Bob Winger, a Jack Day, much more calm, rational voices and minds. Paul Sager. There were now that most of these folks were more on the math science side of things, and just like any university, you had sort of the scientists and the mathematicians, the business people, the humanists, theater, fine arts people, and the social sciences people. And there is always an interesting mix when those groups come together. But those people that I know are still around, like Jack and Bob and Paul and Bill, they would remember a lot of the early days and some of these points. I don't know that anybody was watching the Board of Regents. I couldn't tell you at the time the name of the regent. I mean, they were sort of down there. We were more focused on the legislature.
What about Harrington? There was, I mean, and there was some attention to Madison because they said in one of the articles, Bob Mayer was sort of assigned that he was the liaison to make sure things went right. And I don't know, by Madison they meant the legislature or the whole thing with the university. And he was a scientist of some note. So
yeah. Well, think about this. In the early days, our payroll came out of Madison. I mean, literally, the checks came out of Madison. Any foundation money, which is true even today, was managed in Madison. Almost everything came out of UW-Madison, which is the mothership for all of these services, human resources. So that's why the patterning, when you look at the two most recent campuses, look much more like Madison than they do like what was Chapter 37 or the state universities. Harrington was certainly a figure our chancellor had to relate to that board and to Harrington because Harrington was the chief executive. We didn't hear a lot, I don't think, early on about system, and in that case, the Harrington group, preventing this or opposing that. I think we operated fairly freely. I mean, within the context of what was going on with other campuses at the time.
there was a suggestion, a couple of minor events that suggested he had a personal stake and was attempting to guide some things here. That he took it as a personal sort of a champion for the campus.
He may have, but you have to remember, in the period in which this campus was founded, and for the first at least year and a half, Fred Harvey Harrington was doing all he could to keep the National Guard off the UW-Madison campuses. This was the great upheaval time of student protests and Vietnam and civil rights. Several chancellors had gone down, Robin Fleming being the one that people would point to, were fired because they didn't keep things in order in the eyes of particularly the Republican legislators at the time. So he may well have had some ideas or some passions or whatever, but I think from a practical standpoint, Madison was fully occupied trying to keep Madison together and keep out of the hair of the.
Who were the most vocal legislators about UW-Green Bay or things that affected that I should look into in terms of their records?
Well, I think Cletus Vanderperen was one who was there. Senators at the time, there's a senator on the west side was an Irish name, O'Malley, something like that.